The emergency ward of the Solari Medical Station was not a place for chaos. It was a place of precision, of carefully managed crises, of life and death balanced on the edge of science. At least that was what Lirak had believed before the humans arrived. Now, standing in the medical bay, his three eyes locked onto the unconscious form of Quentin, Lirak felt something he had never encountered before: doubt. "This is impossible," Lirak muttered, his mandibles clicking in frustration. He should not be alive. The human lay on the medical slab, his body pale, his breathing shallow. The wound, a deep laceration across his abdomen, had been severe enough that Lirak had assumed he was dead when they first dragged him in. The blood loss alone should have killed him. Any other species in the known systems would not have survived long enough to make it to the medical bay, let alone still be clinging to life after treatment. Dr. Tallis, the senior medic, adjusted the sterile field above Quentin's torso. He is not stable yet. Lirak's appendages tensed. He should not be stable at all, he said. How much blood did he lose? Dr. Tallis tapped the display. Nearly 30% of his total volume. Lirak recoiled. 30%? That is a fatal loss threshold for nearly all intelligent species. And yet, here he is, Dr. Tallis said. The human's body had been through immense trauma. The cut had gone deep, severing muscle layers and nicking an internal organ. They had sealed the wound, replenished his fluids, and done a blood transfusion. They placed him in a controlled healing state, but even with their technology, a recovery of this magnitude should have been impossible. Lirak studied the monitor readings. His heart rate is erratic, oxygenation levels are low, and his blood pressure is barely holding. How can he still be alive? Dr. Tallis sighed. Humans are difficult to categorize. They are biologically inefficient in many ways, and yet they possess redundancies that allow them to survive conditions that should be fatal. Lirak's mandibles twitched. That is illogical. Dr. Tallis gestured toward the bed. And yet, there he is. Lirak had studied human physiology before. He had read about their adaptability, their immune responses, their odd pain tolerance. He had dismissed most of it as exaggeration. But now, looking at Quentin's unmoving form, he wasn't so sure. A groan interrupted his thoughts. It was faint, barely a sound at all, but both medics turned sharply toward the human. Quentin's fingers twitched. His eyelids fluttered but did not fully open. His breathing hitched, and a strained noise escaped his throat. He should not be regaining consciousness, Lirak said. He is not awake yet, Dr. Tallis corrected. His brain is reacting to the trauma. He may slip in and out for some time. Lirak had seen species struggle with medical recovery before. But this was different. Quentin should have been in a deep, medically induced state, yet his body was fighting against it. Is this normal for them? Lirak asked. Dr. Tallis hesitated. I do not believe normal applies to humans. Lirak exhaled sharply through his respiratory vents. I thought they were fragile. Dr. Tallis nodded. So did I. The medical bay fell into silence save for the steady beeping of the monitors. Quentin did not move again, his body still weak from the massive trauma it had endured. Lirak knew the human was not out of danger. The damage was extensive, and even if his body was stubbornly refusing to die, the risk of infection, organ failure, or neurological damage remained. He would have to watch, observe, try to understand. Because for the first time in his training, Lirak was forced to admit that he had no idea what he was dealing with. Lirak had never spent so much time monitoring a single patient. Usually the medical ward functioned with efficiency: treatment, stabilization, recovery, discharge, but Quentin's case defied every expectation. It had been 3 rotations since the human arrived, and despite the advanced regenerative treatments, he remained motionless. His body was healing, but at a frustratingly slow pace compared to other species that passed through the ward. Lirak found himself checking the monitors more often than necessary, as if expecting the readings to suddenly make sense. Dr. Tallis entered the room, reviewing the latest scans. His vital signs are improving, but his metabolic recovery remains sluggish. Lirak studied the data. Is this a flaw in their biology? Dr. Tallis considered the question, not a flaw, a consequence of their physiology. Humans rely heavily on natural regenerative processes. Our technology assists, but it cannot replace what their bodies must do on their own. Lirak clicked his mandibles in irritation. So we simply wait. Dr. Tallis nodded. Yes, and we monitor for complications. Lirak had never encountered a species where medical intervention had such limitations. Most advanced civilizations in the galaxy could be stabilized and fully recovered within a few rotations, yet Quentin remained trapped between life and unconsciousness, his body stubbornly repairing itself at its own pace. The human shifted slightly, his first movement in hours. Lirak observed as his fingers curled weakly before relaxing again. His breathing had steadied, but he remained unresponsive. How much longer before he regains consciousness? Lirak asked. Dr. Tallis exhaled. It could be many more rotations. Humans do not simply wake when their bodies are restored. They must regain strength, conserve energy, and recover gradually. Lirak struggled to understand the inefficiency, and there is nothing we can do to accelerate this. Not without risking further harm, Dr. Tallis said. Lirak had studied countless medical cases, but nothing prepared him for the patience required in this one. Every other species he had treated either healed quickly under medical intervention or succumbed to their injuries. Humans occupied a strange middle ground, their survival uncertain yet persistent. Another shift from Quentin drew their attention. His eyelids fluttered again, but his body remained still. Lirak studied him with fascination. His body is healing, but his consciousness lags behind. Dr. Tallis placed a scanner over Quentin's head. Brain activity remains steady. He is in a deep regenerative state, not a coma. Lirak had never encountered such a thing. Most species either recovered rapidly or never recovered at all. The idea of a body slowly repairing itself while remaining dormant felt inefficient, and yet it was working. He turned back to Dr. Tallis. How can a species function like this? If they take this long to recover, how do they survive in hostile environments? Dr. Tallis closed her scanner. They survive because they endure, even if it takes time. Lirak observed Quentin for a long moment. He had dismissed humans as fragile creatures, but now he was forced to reconsider. They did not heal quickly, nor did they recover easily, but they did not give up. And that, Lirak realized, might be the most dangerous thing about them. Lirak resisted the urge to check the monitor again. He had already reviewed the readings twice in the last hour, and they had not changed. The human's body was still stabilizing, his progress slow but measurable. Dr. Tallis had briefly left to attend to other patients, leaving Lirak alone with Quentin. The medical bay was quiet, the hum of equipment the only sound. Lirak found himself watching the human's face, searching for any sign of wakefulness. The regenerative treatments were doing their work, but the process remained frustratingly gradual. Lirak had seen species recover from worse injuries in half the time. The human's body, though undeniably resilient, was inefficient in ways that made little logical sense. His internal systems were still struggling to replenish what had been lost. A faint twitch drew Lirak's attention. Quentin's fingers curled slightly, the movement weak and uncoordinated. His eyelids fluttered, though they did not fully open. Lirak leaned forward. "Are you regaining awareness?" Quentin's expression tensed, his brow furrowing slightly. His breathing deepened before settling into a steadier rhythm. Lirak exhaled, adjusting the scanner to record the shift in neural activity. It was a promising sign, but not a breakthrough. The human's body was still in a state of recovery, and full consciousness would take time. A soft chime from the console indicated Dr. Tallis had returned. She stepped into the room, glancing at the readings. Any change? Minor motor responses, Lirak reported. Still unconscious, but neural activity is increasing. Dr. Tallis nodded. Expected. Humans have a slow but deliberate recovery cycle. Lirak considered the data. It remains inefficient. Dr. Tallis gave him a measured look. Inefficiency is not the same as failure. He is recovering. Lirak could not argue with that. The human's body, despite its sluggish progress, was healing. Even with all the medical intervention, Much of it still relied on Quentin's own biological processes to complete the repair. Another shift. This time, Quentin's hand moved toward his abdomen, his fingers grazing the edge of the medical wrap before falling limp again. Neuromuscular response increasing, Lirak noted. Dr. Tallis adjusted the monitoring parameters. He may regain awareness soon. When he does, we must be prepared for disorientation. Lirak processed that. Will he experience cognitive impairment? Not necessarily, Dr. Tallis said. But humans do not handle recovery with the same predictability as other species. Pain levels, mental clarity, emotional responses all vary. Lirak found that unnerving. Most species followed predictable patterns during recovery. The idea that humans might react in unexpected ways only deepened the mystery surrounding them. Quentin's expression shifted again, his brow furrowing more deeply. A faint sound escaped his throat, rough and barely formed. His breathing quickened before settling again. He is attempting to surface, Dr. Tallis observed. Lirak remained focused. How much longer? Dr. Tallis folded her arms. Minutes, perhaps hours. It depends on his individual threshold. Lirak found that answer unsatisfying, but he said nothing. The human's body was stubbornly following its own timeline, and there was little they could do to change that. The only option was to wait and observe. Lirak scrutinized the latest readings, his appendages twitching in restrained frustration. Quentin's neural activity had increased marginally, but his body remained locked in its slow, methodical recovery. Every other species Lirak had treated either succumbed to their injuries or recovered within a predictable time frame. But humans, it seemed, functioned according to their own confounding rules. Dr. Tallis adjusted the hydration levels in Quentin's IV. His electrolyte balance is stabilizing. Lirak exhaled through his respiratory vents. That does not explain why he remains unresponsive. Dr. Tallis gave him a measured look. It does. His body is prioritizing repair over wakefulness. His systems are still compensating for the trauma. Lirak processed that. The human had lost an amount of blood that should have rendered him beyond saving, and yet his organs had continued functioning, albeit at reduced efficiency. Now his body was systematically rebuilding itself, but the process was excruciatingly slow. A shift in movement caught Lirak's attention. Quentin's fingers curled slightly against the sterile sheet before relaxing again. His breathing, while steadier than before, remained shallow. Dr. Tallis adjusted a setting on the monitor. His oxygen saturation is improving. Lirak clicked his mandibles. Then why has he not regained consciousness? Because he's still recovering. The answer was unsatisfyingly vague, but Lirak knew better than to argue. Humans did not follow standard medical patterns, and every attempt to apply logic to their biology only led to further confusion. Another shift. Quentin's head turned slightly, his brow furrowing. This time, his breathing hitched before settling again. Dr. Tallis observed closely. His body is attempting to regain awareness. Lirak noted the slight increase in brain activity on the monitor. He is still not fully awake. No, but he's close. Lirak studied the human's face. His expression remained slack, but the small movements indicated his brain was beginning to reassert control. It was an agonizingly slow process, but it was happening. Dr. Tallis checked the intravenous nutrient levels. We will need to monitor for disorientation when he does regain consciousness. Lirak's appendages tensed. You expect confusion. Dr. Tallis nodded. With this level of trauma? Absolutely. His body has been through significant strain. It will take time for his mind to catch up. Lirak found that concept unsettling. Most species emerged from medical intervention with immediate clarity, barring neurological complications. The idea that humans required additional time to reorient themselves only added to the growing list of their medical peculiarities. Another faint sound escaped Quentin's throat. His fingers twitched again, this time with slightly more control. Dr. Tallis adjusted the scanning parameters. His nervous system is beginning to reassert control. Lirak observed the change in neural readings. Will he regain full awareness soon? Dr. Tallis hesitated. Possibly, but it won't be immediate. Lirak resisted the urge to voice his impatience. If there was one thing he had learned from this case, it was that humans did not conform to expectations. Quentin would wake when his body allowed it, and not a moment sooner. For now, all they could do was wait. Lirak adjusted the environmental controls in the medical bay, ensuring the temperature remained at the optimal range for recovery. Quentin's body had begun to regulate itself more effectively, though his breathing remained uneven. Dr. Tallis had stepped out briefly, leaving Lirak with the responsibility of monitoring the human's progress. The latest neural activity scans indicated increasing consciousness, yet Quentin remained unresponsive. His fingers had moved several times, his facial muscles occasionally tensing, but his awareness seemed trapped beneath layers of exhaustion. Lirak had seen such delayed recoveries before, but never in a species that was supposed to be as fragile as humans were reported to be. A low sound emerged from the human's throat, rough and indistinct. Lirak focused intently, prepared to document any signs of verbal coherence. Quentin's breathing deepened, his chest rising and falling with more control. His head shifted slightly, his eyes flickering beneath closed lids. Lirak activated the physiological scanner, tracking neural responses. Brain activity had increased steadily over the last 3 cycles, but this was the first time there had been sustained movement. He noted the subtle shifts in muscle tension, the gradual return of voluntary control. Dr. Tallis re-entered, her gaze moving immediately to the patient. She checked the readouts before addressing Lirak. Signs of emerging consciousness. Yes. Increased neuromuscular response, controlled respiration. He is attempting to wake. Dr. Tallis adjusted the intravenous stabilizers. His body has been in a prolonged healing state. He will likely experience significant disorientation. Lirak studied the human's face. His expression remained tense, his body still sluggish. What impairments should we anticipate? Cognitive lag, motor instability, possible confusion, Dr. Tallis replied. His body has been prioritizing survival. His neural functions have to recalibrate. Lirak found the process inefficient, but he had learned not to expect efficiency from human biology. Their survival mechanisms were effective, if frustratingly slow. Another shift. Quentin's fingers curled against the bedding, his brow furrowing slightly. His breathing hitched before settling again. Dr. Tallis observed closely. He's close. Lirak watched as the human's eyelids fluttered, his muscles tensing in brief, uneven contractions. His fingers flexed again, this time with more coordination. A low noise escaped his throat, rough and strained. Then, slowly, his eyelids parted. His gaze was unfocused, his pupils dilating unevenly as he struggled to process his surroundings. His breathing deepened, his chest rising with a slow, deliberate inhale. Lirak noted the sluggish reaction time, the delayed response as his eyes attempted to track movement. Dr. Tallis activated the external monitoring system, tracking his vitals in real time. Quentin, can you understand me? The human's lips parted, but no sound emerged at first. His gaze flickered, his expression shifting between confusion and effort. His fingers twitched again, moving toward his abdomen before falling still. Lirak adjusted the neural scanner. His cognitive functions remained disrupted. Dr. Tallis nodded. Expected. Quentin's throat worked as he attempted to speak again. His voice, when it finally emerged, was hoarse. His words were barely formed, but there was intent behind them. His breathing remained strained, his muscles sluggish, but he was conscious. Lirak observed the slow return of awareness, the way the human's body resisted full coordination. His survival had already defied expectations, but now, as he struggled to reassert control over his own functions, Lirak found himself even more perplexed. Dr. Tallis adjusted the medical interface. His vitals remained stable. His recovery is progressing. Lirak did not respond immediately. He had believed humans were fragile, that their biology was prone to failure under extreme conditions. But Quentin had survived trauma that should have been fatal, had endured a recovery process that should have been impossible. And now, even in his weakened state, he was awake. Quentin's eyelids fluttered again, his gaze unfocused as he sluggishly scanned the medical bay. His breathing remained uneven, but he was conscious. Lirak had expected confusion, perhaps distress, but instead the human's expression settled into something else: calculation. Dr. Tallis leaned in slightly. Quentin, can you comprehend your surroundings? The human's throat worked as if forming words was a battle of its own. His voice emerged rough, barely above a whisper. Where? His brow furrowed, the effort to think evident. Lirak answered before Dr. Tallis could. You are in the Solari medical ward. You sustained a life-threatening injury and have been recovering. Quentin's gaze shifted toward him, sluggish but intent. His lips parted again, but no words came immediately. He exhaled sharply, his fingers flexing weakly against the bedding. Dr. Tallis adjusted the monitoring interface. You lost a significant volume of blood and underwent extensive treatment. Your body is still in the process of stabilizing. Do not attempt to move yet. Quentin blinked slowly, as if processing required deliberate effort. Then his lips twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile but held a ghost of amusement. Still here, he rasped. Lirak stared. I do not understand. Quentin's gaze flickered toward him, sluggish but aware. Didn't. His breathing hitched slightly, but he let out a faint huff, something resembling satisfaction. Lirak's mandibles twitched. You seem unsurprised. Quentin's eyelids drooped briefly before he forced them open again. His voice remained strained but carried a dry tone. Not my first time. Lirak exchanged a glance with Dr. Tallis. You have survived similar injuries before. Quentin's fingers twitched against the blanket again. Not this bad, he admitted, but close. Dr. Tallis adjusted the intravenous stabilizers. Your body is still in a fragile state. You should not exert yourself by speaking excessively. Quentin's lips twitched again, but he obeyed, his breathing steadying slightly as he settled back against the bed. Lirak observed him closely. You are aware of the severity of your condition. Quentin's gaze met his, sluggish but unwavering. Yeah. Lirak hesitated. And yet you appear accustomed to it. The human exhaled slowly. Humans get hurt a lot. Dr. Tallis monitored the neural activity readings. That does not mean such injuries should be treated as routine. Quentin's expression shifted into something unreadable. We don't want them to be, he admitted, but sometimes they are. Lirak studied him, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he had previously believed. You should not have survived this. Your recovery should not have been possible. Quentin's throat worked again as he swallowed. But I did. Dr. Tallis adjusted the metabolic readings. Your body is still in a delicate state. Survival does not mean there are no consequences. Quentin's gaze drifted toward the ceiling for a long moment before returning to them. That's how it goes. Lirak processed that statement, finding it insufficient. You accept this as normal. A faint, tired exhale. Not normal, Quentin murmured, just possible. Dr. Tallis regarded him for a moment before speaking again. Your body will require further rest before full stabilization. We will monitor for any complications. Quentin gave a sluggish nod, his exhaustion beginning to overtake him again. His grip on wakefulness was tenuous, his body still prioritizing recovery. Lirak observed him closely as his eyelids grew heavier. You should not be alive, he said, more to himself than to the human. Quentin's lips parted slightly, his voice barely audible. But I am. And with that, his consciousness slipped again, his body surrendering to the demands of healing. Dr. Tallis adjusted the monitoring parameters. He will need further cycles of rest, but his awareness is returning. Lirak remained silent for a long moment before finally speaking. I underestimated them. Dr. Tallis glanced at him. Most do. Lirak looked at the sleeping human, still fragile, still recovering, but undeniably alive. He had believed them weak, vulnerable, yet Quentin had endured. Perhaps humans were not as fragile as he had once thought.